This is Lecture 73B, Classical History in Turkey, Legend and Archaeology. Turkey and Greece, or the Aegean and Anatolian kingdoms of Asia Minor, make up the subject matter of early written, mostly mythical, legendary accounts of Western slave stage civilizations. Now, the area includes the islands of the Aegean Sea and the central uplands of modern Turkey. That is the area from the coastal plain of the Aegean Sea east to the mountains on the Armenian border, then from the narrow coast of the Black Sea south to the Taurus Mountains and Mediterranean coast. The remnant stories of the early servitude epic societies we have just reviewed, such as those about the Hattian, Akkadian, Assyrian, and Hittite peoples, provide us with many examples of the daily lives of its citizens and their trade. Now, after the fall of the Hittites, the new states of Phrygia and Lydia stood near Turkey's western coast as Greek slave stage city-states arose. Along the way, an ever-present Persian Empire was ready to absorb them. And that it did. For the next 200 years, all of Anatolia came under the Achaemenid Persian rule. Their system of local government divided in satrapies in Anatolia that allowed many port cities to grow and to become wealthy. Their governors revolted periodically, but did not pose a serious threat. In the aftermath of the Greco-Persian Wars, all of Anatolia still remained under Persian control. The Greek, Alexander the Great, finally wrested control of the whole region from Persia in successive battles, proving victorious over the Persian Darius III. After Alexander's death, his conquests were split among several of his trusted generals, but were under constant threat of invasion from both the Gauls and other powerful rulers in Pergamon, Pontus, and Egypt. The Seleucid Empire, the largest of Alexander's territories that included Anatolia, became involved in a disastrous war with Rome, culminating in the battles of Thermopylae and Magnesia. The resulting Treaty of Apamea in 188 BC saw the Seleucids retreat from Anatolia. The Kingdom of Pergamum and the Republic of Rhodes, Rome's allies in the war, were granted the former Seleucid lands in Anatolia. Anatolia subsequently became contested between the neighboring rivaling Romans and the Parthian Empire, which frequently culminated in the Roman-Parthian Wars. Now, Roman control of Anatolia was strengthened by a hands-off approach by Rome, allowing local control to govern effectively and providing military protection. In the early 4th century, Constantine the Great established a new administrative center at Constantinople, and by the end of the 4th century, a new Eastern Empire was established. That is, a new Eastern Roman Empire was established, with Constantinople as its capital, referred to by historians as the Byzantine Empire, from the original name of Byzantium. In the subsequent centuries, up to including the advent of the early Middle Ages, the Parthians were succeeded by Sassanid Persians. The centuries of rivalry between Rome and Persia again culminated in frequent wars over the soil of what is now Anatolia. Now, what was this all about? The hunting and gathering bands and tribes of the Old Stone Age had worldviews we in anthropology call animism and animatism. Put simply, this means that the living and non-living things of the environment in which people find themselves are ascribed supernatural powers in some way. As society undergoes the transition to reliance on agriculture and animal husbandry in the new Stone Age, so do their worldviews take on the new mode of production in an appropriate accommodation that features the idea of controlled fertility. Now, the transition from primitive communism through the two chiefdom stages is reflected in the emerging worldviews. Of special interest to us is the ranking of supernatural causation. Items from the environment are made part of a ranked worldview. All ATCs featured an ordered hierarchy of supernatural entities that reflects the ranking of society. Now, the emergence of classes from the ranks that happens with the beginning of slave stage societies is reflected in a hierarchy of professional specialists. It is their task to assist the state apparatus, that is the army and police, in maintaining the unequal nature of access to the means of production. A concomitant is maintaining the unequal nature of possessing the articles of production. A hierarchy of gods in ideology corresponds to the hierarchy of ruling families and their nobility. This hierarchy features the gods in internecine conflict that reflects the ongoing, never-ending struggle of the ruling families and their gnome bosses for more of social product for themselves. Stealing through war is the most common and most obvious way to get this additional product, especially since squeezing the masses means exacerbating the contradictions the state apparatus must deal with. That in itself has far-reaching antithetical ramifications. Slave and intermediate classes revolt, and this is reflected in the army and the navy of these slave-stage kingdoms, whose sons are the soldiers and sailors, increasingly unlikely to stay neutral in the class struggle. Now, the kingdoms and city-states of Greece and Turkey are deeply involved in this internecine warfare precisely for this reason. That is, the ruling classes' ongoing, never-ending attempt to further enrich themselves in the product of slave and intermediate classes. So the legends that have come down to us via the historical and always semi-mythical written record tell these events in that way. Archaeology delves into this period of what we call the classical past in an attempt to reconstruct the actual events in scientific terms of cause and process. One feature that exists in both legend and reality is deification of the top dogs. This was true throughout the Old World classical period in Greece and Anatolia, and of course in Mesopotamia, Egypt, Persia, and nuclear China. A feature film now on Netflix called 300 is an example of the fictional narrative in coalescence with the reality of Greek Sparta versus the Persian Empire. In short, what it is all about is that it is safer to arm your thugs to fight and steal from outsiders than it is to send them to fight and steal from their own people. Now we come to the old Hittite Kingdom. Hittites invaded the Hattin Kingdom in the early 18th century BC. Hattush was burned to the ground in 1700 BC by King Anita of Kusar after overthrowing King Payushti. He then set up his capital at Kanesh, which is 100 miles southeast. By 1650 BC, the Hittites had acculturated the Hattians, and Hattush became a Hittite city by the second half of the 17th century BC, and King Hattusili I moved his capital back to Hattush from Kanesh. In the 16th century BC, the Old Hittite Empire, that ran from the 17th through the 15th centuries BC, encompassed central Anatolia, northwest Syria as far as Ugarit, and upper Mesopotamia. Kizzuwatna in southern Anatolia controlled the region separating the Hittite Empire from Syria, extorting fees from merchants along the trade routes. Overall peace was maintained between the empires through commercial treaties. Then we come to the Middle Hittite Kingdom. In 1460 BC, following the reign of Telepinu, the Hittite Kingdom entered the historical period known as the Middle Kingdom. That period runs from the reign of Telepinu's son-in-law, Alumwamna, to that of Muwatalli I in 1400 BC. King Dudahaya I in the early 14th century BT started the new Hittite Kingdom and the new era of Hittite power, often referred to as the Hittite Empire. The kings took on a divine role in Hittite society, and the Hittite peoples, often allied with neighbors, such as the Kizzuwatna, began to expand again, moving into western Anatolia, absorbing the Luwian state of Arzawa and the Asuwa League. It was not until the reign of King Suppiluliuma that lasted from 1344 to 1322 BC that Kizzuwatna was taken over fully, although the Hittites still preserved their cultural accomplishment in Kumani, which is now the town of Sur in Turkey, and Lazawatinya north of Cilicia. In the 13th century, after the reign of Hattusili III, from 1267 to 1237 BC, Hittite power began to wane, threatened by Egypt to the south and Assyria to the east, effectively ending with Suppiluliuma II from 1207 to 1178 BC. Now, they come to the end of the Hittites. After the 1180s BC, with the arrival of the Sea Peoples and the collapse of Slave Stage Bronze Age in the Levant, the Hittite Empire disintegrated. Arising from the ruins were several independent Neo-Hittite city-states. Some survived until the 8th century BC. In the west, Greeks were arriving on the Anatolian coast. The Kaskians left their northern mountainous East Pontic part of Anatolia, between the core Hittite region in eastern Anatolia and the Black Sea, arriving along the northern Black Sea coast. In 1200 BC, Hattush itself was destroyed, and the empire was replaced by several kingdoms as the Bronze Age transitioned into the Iron Age. And that brings us to Mycenae from 1600 to 1100 BC. Mycenaean Greece was the last phase of the Bronze Age in ancient Greece. It was the high point of the early slave stage Greece, featuring palaces, urban organization, and works of art and a writing system. Among the urban profit centers were 1. Pylos, Tiryns, Medea in the Peloponnese, 2. the Orchomenos, Thebes, and Athens in central Greece, and 3. the Olkos in Thessaly, and 4. the most prominent site was Mycenae in Argolid, after which this Greek cultural area is named. So Mycenaean and Mycenaean-influenced settlements also appeared in Epirus, Macedonia, on islands in the Aegean Sea, on the coast of Asia Minor, and in the Levant, Cyprus, and in Italy. Science, engineering, and writing. The Mycenaean Greeks made innovations in the field of engineering, architecture, and military infrastructure. Their armed forces were responsible for safeguarding trade over vast areas of the Mediterranean, essential to the Mycenaean economy. Their syllabic script, the linear B, is the first written record in the Greek language. The Olympic Pantheon of gods is presented as the centerpiece in their religion. Classes and the state. Classical Mycenaean Greece was made up of military dictatorships. It was a network of palaces, ruling rigid hierarchical, political, social, and economic structures. The preserved linear B records deal with administrative issues and give the impression that Mycenaean palatial administration was highly uniform, with the use of the same language, terminology, system of taxation, and distribution. And the Pylos archive is representative. The top dog was a king called the Wanax, W-A-N-A-X, overseeing all aspects of life from religious feasting and offerings to the distribution of goods, craftsmen, and the state apparatus, that is, the army, navy, and police. Under him was the Lauagetes, that is, the leader of the people, whose role was a carryover from the ATC high priest. Both Wanax and Lauagetes were at the head of a military aristocracy known as the Equeta, E-Q-E-T-A. The land possessed by the Wanax was called the Temenos. At Pylos, there was a man named Anchelion as a king. Now, these bosses appointed an agricultural hierarchy to run the districts, headed by a choritor, or governor, with a deputy called the prochoritor, under which were Damokoros, a Mycenaean form of kulak. A council of elders called the Gerousia carried over from the ATC days and had social responsibilities in governing. In Sparta, the Gerousia had been composed of men over the age of 60, created by the Spartan lawgiver Lycurgus in the 7th century BC in his Great Retra, that is, a document called the Great Pronouncement. A combined form of civil and military command was called the Basileus. Now, Mycenaean society was divided into two groups of freemen: the king's entourage, who conducted administrative duties at the palace, and the people, called Demo, D-A-M-O. These last were policed by the king's secret agents. The demos had to perform as ordered and so were only relatively free. More appropriately, they would be called serfs. They had to pay taxes to the palace. In the palace itself were the bureaucrats, who helped themselves to whatever they could get their hands on, and they lived in the luxurious residences close to the principal Mycenaean palaces. Professional specialists were an early form of petty bourgeoisie, marginally better off than the demo, including craftsmen, kulak farmers, and merchants. Occupying the lowest rung of the social ladder were the slaves, called doulos, D-O-U-L-O-S. Now, Mycenaean Greece perished with the Eastern Mediterranean Bronze Age and collapsed. It was followed by the Greek Dark Ages, transitional period leading to the Archaic Greece, where political power shifted from slave-based palace rule to feudal local boss-ruled unfree farmers employing iron tools in the fields. Mycenaean Greece collapsed because of class struggle, namely the revolts of the slaves, serfs, and the de facto unfree professional specialists. The Mycenaean period is best known to posterity as the historical setting of ancient Greek literature and mythology, including the Trojan Wars. However, there is very little information about early Mycenaean presence in Turkey. The city of Milet from 1450 to 1100 BC was a center of Mycenaean presence in Anatolia. The zone of intense Mycenaean settlement extended as far as Bodrum, Halicarnassus. Antarcia was a 15th to 4th century BC Greek army boss. He conducted the first recorded Mycenaean military activity on the Anatolian mainland, and his activities are recorded in the Hittite archives of 1400 BC. The Mycenaean sphere of influence in Asia Minor occurs in the archaeological record only for the region between the peninsula of Halicarnassus in the south and Milet in the north, and in the islands off this coastline between Rhodes in the south and Kos and Samos in the north. The Carians were ancient Greek inhabitants of Caria, C-A-R-I-A, in southwest Anatolia. British archaeologist J.M. Cook has studied the Greek historical literature dealing with the Carians, and he points to the similarities between the Carians and the Mycenaeans. And that brings us to the Turkish Iron Age of 1300 to 600 BC that was characterized by the widespread use of iron and steel. It witnessed the development of alphabets and early literature. It formed the last phase of prehistory, spanning the period between the collapse of the slave stage Bronze Age and the rise of classical slave stage. In Anatolia, the regional Neo-Hittite kingdoms replaced the dissolution of the Hittite Empire. These included Troad, Ionia, Lydia, Caria, and Lycia in the west, Phrygia centrally, and Samaria and Urartu in the northeast, while the Assyrians occupied much of the southeast. Troy. The Troad, or Troy, on the Biga Peninsula was the northernmost of the western Aegean settlements in this period. Evidence for Troy is both legendary and archaeological. There were settlements in this region dating back to 3000 BC, and archaeology records successive civilization referred to as Troy I to Troy IX, and I give the various dates. Iron Age Troy corresponds to Troy 7 through 8 and coincides with the Homeric account of Troy and the Trojan Wars. Aeolus. Ancient Greek settlements existed in western Anatolia during the 11th to 8th century BC. Aeolus was an area of the northwestern Aegean coast between Troad and Ionia, from the Hellespont to the Hermus River, Gides, west of Mysia and Lydia. By the 8th century BC, the 12 most important Aeolian cities formed a league. In the 6th century, Lydia and then Persia conquered these cities. Ionia is next, and that was part of a group of settlements from the central Aegean coast. To the east was Lydia, to the south Caria, and together with were the Ionian League. Originally, the Ionians had been expelled from the Peloponnesus by the Dorians and sought refuge on the Anatolian coast of Turkey, thanks to the Greeks of Athens who assisted them. Among themselves they jostled until the Lydian king Croesus, from 560 to 545 BC, took Ionia, which then fell to the Persians. After the defeat of Persia by the Greeks, Ionia again became independent until absorbed by the Roman province of Asia. And that brings us to Lydia, which was to the west of Phrygia and the east of Ionia and spoke an Anatolian language related to the Luwian and Hittite. From 1300 BC, Lydia was an Iron Age kingdom of Western Asia Minor located east of the ancient Ionia in the modern western Turkish province of Usak, Manisa, and inland Izmir. Its population spoke an Anatolian language known as Lydian. Its capital was Sardis. The kingdom of Lydia existed from about 1200 BC to 546 BC. At its greatest extent, during the 17th century BC, it covered all of western Anatolia. In 546 BC, it became a province of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, known as the satrapy of Lydia or Sparta in Old Persian. In 133 BC, it became part of the Roman province of Asia. Coinage was developed in Lydia around the 7th century BC. The Heraclids, a group of Dorian kings, conquered the Peloponnesian kingdoms of Mycenae, Sparta, and Argos, according to Greek mythology, and ruled from 1185 to 687 BC. As Greek mercantile capitalists became more powerful in Smyrna, Colophon, and Ephesus, their Heraclidian counterparts weakened. The last Heraclidian king, Candalus, was murdered by his friend and lance-bearer Gygas, who replaced him. Gygas waged war against the intruding Greeks. He was soon faced, however, by his own crisis. The Cimmerians began to pillage outlying cities within the Heraclidian kingdom, and these attacks led to the incorporation of Phrygia and its capital Gordium into the Lydian domain. It was not until the successive rulers of Sadeats and Alaiats II, ending in 560 BC, that the attacks of the Cimmerians ended for good. Under the reign of the last Lydian king, Croesus, Lydia reached its greatest expansion. Lydia was invaded first at the inconclusive Battle of Pteria, driving deeper into Persia, searching for a battlefield that could make victory possible. Croesus thought he had found it at Thimbra. Now, Thimbra was located on the plain by the same name in modern times, in the Turkish called Thimbrekdir. The plain is on the river Thymbrius, today known as the Kemur River, at the confluence of the Thymbrios and the Scamander. Now, the distance from Ilium, the town erected by the Romans on the old site of Troy, to the temple was about 50 stadia. At any rate, in 546 BC, Croesus got his ass handed to him in the Battle of Thimbra by the Persian Cyrus II. Following Croesus' defeat, Lydia fell under the hegemony of Persia, Greece, Rome, and Byzantium, until finally being absorbed into the Turkish lands. And that brings us to Lycia, which was formed on the southernmost settlement of western Anatolia in what is now the Teak Peninsula on the western Mediterranean coast. The historic Lycian sites include Xanthos, Patara, Myra, Pinara, Tlos, Olympus, and Phaselis. The Lycian League were city-states alternating between Persian and Greek rule, and the League was incorporated into Rome and Byzantium and then Turkey. Lydia, Phrygia, Samaria, and Assyria, the 9th to 7th centuries BC. The west-central coast of Anatolia became the domain of the Phrygian kingdom following the fragmentation of the Hittite Empire during the 12th century BC. It existed independently until the 7th century BC and is important in Greek mythology. Greeks from Thrace became the Phrygians with their capital at Gordium, now Yazilikaya. They built an extensive network of roads to conduct trade. They also held tightly onto a lot of the Hittite facets of culture and adapted them over time. King Midas is well known from ancient Greek and Roman writers and was the last of the Phrygian kings. The mythology of Midas revolves around his ability to turn objects to gold by mere touch, as granted by Dionysus. at his unfortunate encounter with Apollo, from which his ears were turned into the ears of a donkey. The historical record of Midas shows that he lived approximately between 740 and 696 BC and represented Phrygia as a great king. The Assyrians knew Phrygia as Mushki. Historians consider him King Mita of the Mushkis, as noted in Assyrian accounts, and the Assyrians thought of Mita as a dangerous foe of Sargon II, their ruler at the time. Thus, Sargon happily negotiated a peace treaty in 709 BC. However, the Cimmerians in the east streamed into Phrygia, overthrowing King Midas in 696 BC, and following Midas' death, Phrygia lost its independence and became a vassal of its western neighbors, Lydia, Persia, Greece, Rome, and Byzantium, as time passed on and disappeared in the Turkish era. Cimmeria was a region of northeastern Anatolia. It appears in the 8th century BC in the north and east, facing the eastern Scythian advance. They continued to move west, invading and subjugating Phrygia, 696 to 695 BC, and penetrated as far south as Cilicia and west into Ionia after pillaging Lydia. The Lydian campaigns between 637 and 626 BC effectively halted this advance. Afterwards, Cimmeria weakened until its last recorded mention in 515 BC. And that brings us to Urartu under Arabu from 860 to 840 BC. The kingdom of Urartu occupied northeast Anatolia on Lake Van, that is the Nairi Sea, to the south of the Cimmerians and north of Assyria. Its prominence ran from its appearance in the 9th century BC until the Medes overran it in the 6th century BC. Urartu is first mentioned as a loose confederation of smaller entities in the Armenian highlands in the 13th to 11th centuries BC. It was subject to recurrent Assyrian incursions before emerging as a powerful neighbor by the 9th century BC, and this was facilitated by Assyria's weak position in the 8th century BC. Urartu continued to resist Assyrian attacks and reached its greatest extent under Argishti I, that is from 785 to 760 BC. At that time, it included present-day Armenia, southern Georgia almost to the Black Sea, west to the sources of the Euphrates, and south to the sources of the Tigris. Following this, Urartu suffered a number of setbacks. King Tiglath-Pileser III of Assyria conquered it in 745 BC. By 714 BC, it was being ravaged by both Cimmerian and Assyrian raids, and after 645 BC, Scythian attacks provided further problems for Urartu, forcing it into dependence on Assyria. However, Assyria itself fell to a combined attack of Scythians, Medes, and Babylonians in 612 BC. It was a Persian satrapy for a while from the 6th century BC before becoming an independent Armenia. To this day, Urartu forms an important part of Armenian nationalist sentiment. Assyria. In the Iron Age, Assyria included southeastern Anatolia. Assyria, one of the great powers of the Mesopotamian region, had a long history from the 25th century BC Bronze Age until its final collapse in 612 BC at the end of the Iron Age. Assyria's Iron Age corresponds to the Middle Period resurgence of the Neo-Assyrian Empire in its last 300 years, and its territory is modern-day Iraq. Assyria influenced Anatolian politics and culture after its traders first encountered Hattians in the late Bronze Age. By the 13th century BC, Assyria was expanding to its northwest at the expense of the Hittites, and to the north at the expense of Urartu. Assyrian expansion reached its height under Tukulti-Ninurta I, that is from 1244 BC to 1208 BC, following which it was weakened by internal dissent. The collapse of the Hittite Empire at the end of the Bronze Age coincided with an era of renewed Assyrian expansion under Ashur-resh-ishi I from 1134 1103 BC to 1116 BC, and soon thereafter Assyria added the Anatolian lands in what is now Syria to its empire. Tiglath-Pileser I from 1115 BC to 1077 BC then commenced incursions against the Neo-Hittite Phrygians, followed by the Luwian kingdoms of Commagene, Cilicia, and Cappadocia. With the death of Tiglath-Pileser I, Assyria declined during what is referred to as the Ancient Dark Ages from 1075 to 912 BC in that region that corresponds to the collapse of the Bronze Age. The last 300 years of the Assyrian Empire, or the Neo-Assyrian Empire, from 911 to 627 BC, saw its renewed expansion with attacks on the Neo-Hittite states to the north and west. Ashur-Nasirpal II, 883 to 859 BC, extracted tribute from Phrygia, while his successor, Shalmaneser III, from 858 to 823 BC, attacked Urartu, forcing his Anatolian neighbors to pay tribute. After his death, the land was torn by civil war. Assyrian power continued to wax and wane with periodic incursions into the Anatolian lands. Sennacherib, from 705 to 681 BC, encountered and drove back Greeks, who were a new force in the region, attempting to settle Cilicia. His successor, Esarhaddon, from 680 to 669 BC, was responsible for the final destruction of Urartu. Ashurbanipal, from 669 to 627 BC, then extended Assyrian influence, still further placing Caria, Cilicia, Lydia, and Cappadocia into vassalage. However, Assyria found its resources stretched to maintain the integrity of its vast empire, and civil war again erupted following the death of Ashurbanipal. Vassal states stopped paying tribute, regaining their independence, and the weakened Assyrian state was now faced by a new threat, a coalition of Iranian peoples to its east and north, including Medes, Persians, Scythians, and the Anatolian Cimmerians, who attacked Assyria in 616 BC. Nineveh, the capital, fell in 612 BC, and the Assyrian Empire was finally swept away in 605 BC. With the collapse of Assyria ended not only the Iron Age, but also the era referred to as prehistory, to make way for what has been variously described as recorded history, or more specifically, late ancient history or classical civilization. However, these terms are not precise or universal, and they do overlap. After the Arab Islamic conquest of the mid-7th century AD, Assyristan, or Assyria, was dissolved. The previously basic pastoral culture of the desert-dwelling Arabs was enhanced and enriched by the influence and knowledge of native Mesopotamian scientists, physicians, mathematicians, theologians, astronomers, architects, agriculturalists, artists, and astrologers. The Aramaic language and Syrian Christianity in the Middle East and Central Asia was annihilated by Tamerlane in the 14th century AD. Assyrian Christians, especially Nestorian, contributed to the Arab Islamic civilization during the Umayyads and the Abbasids by translating works of Greek philosophers to Syriac and afterwards to Arabic. They also excelled in philosophy, science, such as, and then I give the names of all of them, and theology, and give their names, and the personal physicians of the Abbasid caliphs were often Assyrian Christians, such as the long-serving Muqtashu dynasty. However, despite this, indigenous Assyrians became second-class citizens in a greater Arab Islamic state. Those who resisted Arabization and conversion to Islam were subject to religious, ethnic, and cultural discrimination and had restrictions imposed upon them. They were excluded from specific duties and occupations reserved for Muslims, and they did not enjoy the same political rights as Muslims, and their word was not equal to that of a Muslim in legal and civil matters. They were banned from spreading their religion further in Muslim-ruled lands, and men were banned from marrying Muslim women, but at the same time they were also expected to adhere to the same laws of property, contract, and obligation as the Muslim Arabs. The ancient Assyrian capital of Nineveh had its own bishop of the Church of the East at the time of the Arab conquest of Mesopotamia. The Arabs still recognized Assyrian identity in the medieval period, describing them as Assyrian. Assyrian people retaining Akkadian infused and influenced Eastern Aramaic and the Assyrian Church of the East Christianity. It remained dominant in the north of Mesopotamia and what had been Assyria as late as the AD 1300s. The city of Asur was still occupied by Assyrians during the Islamic period until AD 1350, when the Muslim Turco-Mongol ruler Tamerlane conducted a religiously motivated massacre of indigenous Assyrian Christians. After that, there are no traces of a settlement Ashur in the archaeological and numismatic record. Afterwards, the Assyrian population was dramatically reduced in their homeland, and there was a religious schism among the Assyrians of northern Mesopotamia that emerged in the AD 1500s and continued into the AD 1600s, and then a large number of hitherto Assyrian Church of the East adherents from the far north of Mesopotamia entered communion with the Roman Catholic Church. This was after they had become disaffected with the Abuma family's leadership of the Assyrian Church, and after failing to gain acceptance within the Syriac Orthodox Church. Rome named this new church the Church of Assyria and Mosul, and its first leader, Patriarch of the East, Assyrians, in 1553 AD. However, in 1683 AD, Rome altered the name to the Chaldean Catholic Church. This group of Assyrians, eventually known as the Chaldean Catholics, or Chaldo-Assyrians, despite having no ethnic, historical, linguistic, or geographic connections to the long-extinct Chaldean tribe of southeast Mesopotamia. In AD 1800s, the Ottomans started viewing Assyrians and other Christians in their eastern front as a potential threat. Furthermore, constant wars between the Ottomans and the Shiite Safavids encouraged the Ottomans into settling their allies, the nomadic Sunni Kurds, in what is today northern Iraq and southeastern Turkey. Then Kurdish tribal chiefs established semi-independent emirates. The Kurdish emirs sought to consolidate their power by attacking Assyrian communities that were already well established there. Tens of thousands of Assyrians in the Hakkari region were massacred in 1843 when Badr Khan, the emir of Bhutan, invaded their region. After another massacre in 1846, the Ottomans were forced by Europe's capitalist powers into intervening in the region, and the ensuing conflict destroyed the Kurdish emirates, and reasserted Ottoman power in the area. The Assyrians of Ahmed were also subject to the massacres of 1895, and that brings us to the end of the period that leads up to the beginning of capitalism and the arrival of Bolshevism that I'm going to talk about in the next lecture.